Thank you for joining us for another episode of Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence. We're a nonprofit membership organization dedicated to helping you streamline your RFP process through better education, smarter strategies, and more transparency. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive training, discounts to our virtual and in-person events, and the chance to connect with other procurement professionals throughout the year. And if you're planning a professional event or conference, don't forget our CPE Speakers Bureau is available to speak at regional and national gatherings. Now let's get into today's session of Ask the RFP Doctor, where one of our expert RFP doctors will show you how to take on real-world challenges in procurement and supply chain management and break them down into practical strategies you can use right away.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
All right, so we're going to talk about protest today. Here's kind of the main outline. I want to start off with what is a protest? What does that entail? We'll then go through how that actually works and what happens with that. Our team has been tracking the GAO data for this on a period of time. So we have the most recent data available, which is just from a few months ago. We'll talk about why agencies lose a protest. Now, these are some federal level examples, but I think the practices can certainly translate down to folks that may work for school districts or states or different entities. And so that will be available for us. And then we'll talk about, I have a story in the slides we'll tell. Also have another story that's not in the slides, but equally and perhaps more interesting. And then we'll talk about the end, how we actually avoid this in the first place. So Protest 101, we're going to talk about what this means and what this entails. If you've not been through a protest, then we'll explain what that is. If you have been through one, certainly chime in the chat box if there's anything I missed here, or do you have a different approach here? But that would be good. So what is a protest? As the name suggests here, it's when we, as a vendor, are protesting something that happened that we have concerns about. It's a formal challenge to the solicitation itself. Since 1926, the Government Accountability Office, the federal government, has tracked protest. They have annual data about number of protests filed, and we're going to do an analysis here in a little bit that looks at that. But what this is here is filed by any interested parties. It could be a vendor that proposed. It could be an entity, an agency. It could be somebody else that just has an interest in the project, and they can provide their comments about why they might be protesting on that. Who decides it? So at the federal level, the GAO doesn't actually decide a win or a loss, a confirm or deny process for the protest. They just provide their opinion, and then the agencies and the actual legal authorities can make a decision based on what the GAO is recommending. At the local level or at the state level, you may have a chief. For example, we know that some chief procurement officers are not involved directly on a procurement, but they may decide the outcome of a protest, and then people can either accept that or go to court or whatever. But in this case here, the data we're looking at is only a recommendation, which is typically followed, but not always. So one thing here about this, and I imagine you all have similar sorts of requirements, is that there is a timeline for when you have to make these decisions about when you're going to file a protest and what that looks like. So if you're going to protest the solicitation, that has to be done before the proposals are due. So if I'm a vendor and I see that there's some sort of problem or something I don't like about the solicitation, I need to file those before the problems or before the proposals come in. You can protest the award, again, this at the federal level, within 10 days of knowing the basis of what that is. And within 5 days, they require debriefings to keep the automatic hold on those performance alive. Now, I know in some countries and locations, so for example, I know we have some friends from Canada, there are different rules about protests. In fact, Brian and I have worked on a number of Canadian projects over the years. And Brian, I think the rule is protests are not really a thing of what would be involved with that. Is that, so I got that right?
Yeah, my experience for 10, 15 years of doing Canadian public procurements across many provinces is I found that the concern about protests was higher and the actual risk was lower relative to the US. In general, the summation from contract A, contract B, and all the different stuff that we saw over the years up with our friends in the north is they have much better, more protective rules around if you wrote it in the RFP and you didn't demonstrably deviate, then it's kind of hard for the vendor to sustain the protest. But that's definitely painting with a broad brush and probably
Yeah.
oversimplifying substantially.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it certainly varies, but again, just kind of seeing what happens here. So typically, when a protest filed, it will end in one of four ways. Those that are less painful to more painful, and that's generally how this is going to go. One of four ways. Withdrawn, the protester drops it. They have a discussion with the entity or the procurement agents, and they come to an understanding or a clarification, and nothing further is needed, and they shut the whole thing down, and the protest actually doesn't go forward beyond that. Secondly, is dismissed. It's rejected without merits or for a procedural flaw, most often because of timelines. So they file it not with the time frame and they toss it out because they missed the timelines, or because they actually pointed out a flaw in the agency and they addressed those issues before they went further. Say, well, we fixed it. There's nothing to protest. Dismissed. Move on. Number three here is denied. In this case here, the GAO, again at the federal level, but it's certainly similar to the local cases, they don't find merit and they uphold the award as is, and the decision that they made for that procurement stands. And they said, nope, we recognize your protest, we see what you said, and we disagree, denied, move on. And then fourthly here is sustained. That the entity looking at this case finds that there is some sort of violation. They say, yes, you filed this protest on these grounds and we concur. And then they also provide a recommended action to address the particular issue. Now, again, most of the time when there is a sustained protest, the agency on behalf of the GAO, so the GAO is a third party, if you are working on, let's say, the FAA or some other agency, they will usually follow whatever those corrective actions are recommended. Not always, as we'll see here in a little bit, but typically they'll follow the recommendations that the GAO will give to them. So when you talk about this corrective action, what this is here is a voluntary decision to fix a problem in the protest, rather than say, no, we actually did it right. Here's why we don't agree with this corrective action. They choose not to do something with them. Now, this corrective action can happen at any point in time during the protest. And sometimes this may result in changing the RFP, which would certainly have a huge impact. It may mean re-evaluating the proposals based on new information that is developed, making a different award decision, or amending the solicitation. There's different outcomes. Some of these involve a lot of time, others is a simple fix. But hopefully it's something straightforward. But chances are, if somebody's going to spend the time and effort to file a protest, and we get to this point in time, this may not be as an easy resolving that matter. Why this matters, though, a protest is usually dismissed once the agency takes this corrective action that resolves the argument. So kind of what we're recommending here is that if we can resolve it through reasonable accommodations, then we should certainly do that. We don't want to be protested. And if we are protested, what they're asking for is reasonable, then we should certainly be willing to acknowledge that in the first place. So our perspective here at CPE is that if we follow the principles of good procurement, meaning fair, open, transparency, value, and integrity, that will avoid 99.9% of the protest. If you do get protested and you apply all the best practices that we talk about as part of the RFP Doctor or our other classes, then frankly, I have very little concern about protest. Go ahead and protest. It's fine because we know we've done the right thing. And sometimes there are frivolous protests that don't really make a difference in terms of how we think about them. So how often do these protests really happen? Let's jump to the second part here and go through some data just to kind of illustrate what's actually taking place. So protests are actually getting less rare, which in today's some folks will argue is a contentious environment is surprising. But when you look at, again, at the federal data, since 2016 all the way to just a few months ago, on average, things have dropped pretty significantly. Now, if you yourself find that you have protests all the time, obviously that might be a regional or a local issue, but broad strokes at the federal level, we're seeing overall protests here. Now, there's one little thing that I wanted to call out here just as a, wow, that's interesting. If you look at this bump up here, whereas just under 1,600 or just over 1,600, that jumped to 2,000. This big jump here, really interesting, is from a single IT contract that was being awarded. It was actually for the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. They had a $50 billion government-wide IT contract. There's 1,000 vendors that proposed. And basically what happened is that they used a scoring criteria for the vendors that are going to go from phase 1 to phase 2. There's a lot of disagreements as to what's going to happen here. And essentially, there was 350 protests for this one contract. And the essence of that is that you didn't, what they didn't do is they didn't release how they determined that phase 1, phase 2 determination, and people didn't know what happened. And so obviously people were upset about that. Now, if anybody that knows Paul Harvey, which I would love to shake your hand someday, because Paul Harvey, I used to listen to as a kid. My dad loved Paul Harvey. But as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story is that that particular project, the way it turned out, it actually got the entire thing canceled due to an executive order about 2 years ago when they were trying to consolidate multiple IT projects. And so it got wrapped up in that, and it really never got resolved. So that's kind of what happened with that. Okay, so when you look at the data here and how we understand there's two different rates that are provided, but they mean different things. So there's the sustained rate, and then there's the effectiveness rate. So the effectiveness rate is that out of every protest that's filed, it's the share of protesters that got something. Maybe something was changed. They decided to modify the evaluation criteria. They gave more time, whatever. They got something out of that protest. The sustained rate, that 14% on the left-hand side, these are out of the protests that go all the way to the government where they rule on what actually happened. So effectiveness rate means, yeah, we got something, but it didn't actually get all the way to the government. Whereas that sustained rate is we actually went through the entire process, the GAO got involved, and they issued some sort of ruling about what actually takes place here. So the real story is that the 14% is where everybody really talks about, but the effectiveness rate is far more indicative of that, yeah, people had concerns, they did something about it, and they just ended it at that point in time where we go through and look at that. So the grand scheme of things here, when you think about a protest, and the reason why I'm talking about all this data about what these items mean and what happens here, because the issues that come up here, frankly, what Brian and I have seen in our various experiences is not tied to us as procurement, although there are issues tied to procurement. They are, in our opinion, things that could have been addressed much earlier on. And the reality is that, only some of these ones that actually get through. Like if something is going to get all the way to the government's accountability office, chances are there's actually a legitimate problem as part of this here. So the way this works from FY24, 1,800 cases were filed. 1,700 of those were actually closed. 387 actually had a decision, and of those, 61 were actually sustained. So it's out of the total number of cases here, it's a very small number that actually have a sustaining ruling that may affect going forward here. Okay, now we've kind of set the stage here. Let's talk about why agencies lose in the first place. That's kind of why we're here, is why do people get protested and they lose to a protest? And secondly, we'll talk about is, well, how do you avoid a protest in the first place and what we can do to set that up here, right? It's not crazy information. It's not all that crazy case I talked about where we have 350 protests. That's an extreme case. Most of the time, it's not like that. The number one reason why they're sustained has been an unreasonable technical evaluation. So what this means here is that the agency scored the technical proposals in a way that doesn't make sense or didn't hold up. Usually what this means here is they didn't follow, I'll say this 3 times here, they didn't follow their own stated criteria, or the rating doesn't match what the proposal actually said. In other words, an agency, again, this is federal, local, cities, whoever, said, I'm going to do this, but on the procurement, they actually did something different. And that's a very reasonable protest. And out of the top 10 reasons, it's been up there for the last 10 years. Number one reason is unreasonable technical evaluation, primarily because people aren't doing what they say they're going to do. Number two here is for the last number of years is an unreasonable technical evaluation, which is what we just talked about. Unreasonable cost or price evaluation, that was number one for the last 9 to 10 years. A flawed selection decision, meaning that we went through the process, we selected this vendor, and after a protest, they realized, well, that person should have been selected for these reasons. Based on what the proposal said, there was some sort of issue as to what they identified here. Number four here is unreasonable past performance evaluation. So it's interesting when Brian and I really got started, it's actually our team about 20 years ago. Past performance surveys, like questionnaires you fill out, was like the game in town. I mean, some of these questionnaires that our team developed years ago was like 35 questions, answered these on a scale of 1 to 10. And what we found here, we did a big giant statistical analysis, and we found that most of those you could ask one question or 35 questions, the overall outcome will be the same here. Regardless, outside of that, what we're finding here is that the unreasonable past performance evaluation, how we're looking at what they've done in the past, is not reasonable. Another example of that is that Brian and I have been on cases before, projects before, where a vendor proposes and the evaluators say, oh no, we're not going to work with them, they're terrible. But the reality is that first off, you're going to disqualify for somebody based on something else that happens not related to us. That's a very, very slippery slope. Because as we all know that when you think about what makes a project good or bad, is the people involved on that project, not necessarily the logo behind that team of people. So we may have a lot of supposition about what people said or do, and just if we're not careful about making those frankly prejudices about what we think about a team can get us into a lot of trouble. Inadequate documentation of the record or the procurement. So folks, if you are in procurement, documenting what you do, the decisions that are made, and how we got to that final outcome is like of paramount importance. Really, really critical. In fact, we'll talk about how to do this more effectively here, but that's how you do that. Or if you don't do that, then you're going to get a protest. And lastly here is unequal treatment of offers. So for some reason you have a bias, and I don't mean you personally, somebody on your team or on the evaluation committee treats an offer or proposer unfairly that doesn't justify what you're going to do. When this sounds kind of odd here, but when we think about procurements, we don't want a procurement to be fair. Let me clarify about that. What I mean by that is that you want to give your procurement the advantage to the high performers. That's what you want to do here. It should be fair, but give the advantage to the high performers. Out of any other criteria that is not either specified or somehow gives an advantage to somebody that doesn't have a reasonable explanation as to why they're a high performer, we're not interested in that. We don't want to do it. We want to be fair to everybody and treat everybody equally. Let them stand out based on the quality of their proposals and the cost they provide to do that. So when you kind of boil it all down here, kind of the synthesis of top 3 reasons why a protest is sustained is we didn't do what we said we're going to do in the RFP or whatever type of solicitation. You can't prove what you did. Or number 3 here is that the rules were broken from the beginning. That the way there's a fundamental process error in the overall evaluation process, and that led to all sorts of issues because of that. So all of these failures here, they're actually process failures, not judgment calls. That's the key thing with all of this here. It's not tied because that somebody made a poor judgment that they should have picked somebody else here. It's primarily tied to process, which we in procurement have a huge effect on making sure we do that better here. Now we got 2 stories here. This first one is tied to actually an Air Force job. And basically what they had done here is that they had a requirement in the RFP that these satellites had to have the certification at the time of proposal submission. That was a question asked, and the respondent said, yes, it has to be certified at the time you propose. And so that was the question. So yes, you have to do that. 2 companies proposed again. This is all public information. I'm not sharing anything that's private. This is all publicly available. There's a company called ATB Gov. They submitted a proposal for $300 million. The other company, iGov, who actually got the award for $180 million, and ATP filed a protest. And the reason why they filed a protest, they said, well, iGov, theirs wasn't certified at the time of submission. they should be rejected because that's how they answer the question. And what happened here is that the GAO said, yes, that is true. They didn't meet those requirements, and you should cancel the procurement and go back. In reality, the Air Force, again, it's just a guidance or a recommendation. The Air Force said, nope, we're not going to do that. It's going to take too much time. There's money, other national security interests, and they end up awarding to iGov. And furthermore, they had argued that they had been working this entire time. So that's how that turned out. Again, it was a recommendation, and they decided not to do that. Another example that I had a project years and years ago where I used to live in Arizona at the time, and at the time, as you all know, there's how many states don't do changing for the daylight savings? I think it's two, right? Arizona and I think Florida now, and I think that might be it. Anyways, at the time, the project was in Phoenix, and they said the proposals are due at 11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, which for you all that don't know, Phoenix is always at Mountain Standard Time. They never change. And so they filed a protest, and it was interesting. The protest said, well, because you said this time, everybody after this 11 a.m., whatever time, should be denied. Obviously, they said, no, that's not accurate. They didn't actually understand the ruling here. It was quite interesting. So, in fact, talking to the procurement agent, I think his verbal response was, unless you can prove there's a metaphysical change in the universe where Phoenix is no longer in that time zone, protest denied. And it was quite interesting here. So the golden rule here, and this is probably the number one thing that we have seen across all our different experiences, is that clearly state what you're going to do and then actually do it. If you say you're going to look at these criteria and these are the weights you're going to use, and this is the time or the structure you're going to use, make sure you actually do that. That will avoid by far a majority of the problems you might encounter on your overall projects here. So how do we actually do this? We're going to close out here with some practical recommendations. The first thing we're going to do here is like, well, let's think about how we're going to deal with the protest, and how about just avoid a protest altogether? How do we do that? Publish the rules in your RFP. We've seen projects before where they don't provide the criteria. We've seen projects before where they don't provide the weights on the criteria. Provide as much information you possibly can on the protest, because on the RFPs or whatever type of solicitation, because that'll make it a lot easier. So publish the real rules. The second thing here is write the SSP. The SSP stands for the Source Selection Plan. Basically, your guidebook about how you're going to evaluate the proposals before you release the RFP. So one of the classes that Brian and I teach is called Better RFPs, Better Projects with NASPO, and we spend literally an entire hour walking through how to create a source selection plan. If you have your game plan, your guidebook before the RFP is released, this is guaranteed to catch any sort of issues that might come up. The other thing I also tell people is that before you release RFP, have your evaluation matrix and actually make up data and go through and say, do we actually understand how to evaluate the proposals? This is especially useful on cost evaluations. Do you understand how the proposals are going to come in and how you're going to evaluate those proposals? The third thing here is to treat the Q&A that is asked as if it were written as part of the solicitation itself. So if somebody asks a question and you answer that, that's a binding answer, not just a suggestion. I mean, that becomes a part of the record, which us in procurement should be a good job of making sure we maintain all that. And then finally here, folks, I know this might make some people uncomfortable here, but offer debriefings that actually explain what took place. Now, if you say, well, we offer debriefings, nobody ever comes, that's part of the challenge here, is that we need to convince our vendors that we as a public entity, we really want to offer you debriefing. And when people come in here, don't just give them, slop on a page. And again, I don't mean to be offensive here, but actually take the time to go through and explain, here's where you all stood, here's the averages, here's what you did well, and here's where our team had concerns. What we have found after running literally thousands of procurements, the number one reason why people come to a debriefing is not to find something they can protest on. When people come to a debrief, what they are genuinely looking for is some feedback and guidance on what they can do better next time. And if we go with the mindset that that's truly what the vendors are trying to get, and then we offer that as part of the debriefing, that's going to fix so many people that want to file a protest. Now they better understand and say, okay, that's fine, not filing a protest. If a protest is filed, make it defensible. Document as you evaluate. And that's why you talk to your evaluators. And folks, I know you have experiences that you have evaluators that don't give you good feedback about how they rated something. If you see that, then talk to them and explain to your evaluator, like, look, some folks, unless you want to come to court with me and justify why you did what you did and explain it, you've got to help me out. Put your bullet points, explain what your reason is, because it's very beneficial for us, right? The second thing is make every score a sentence, not just a label, but actually talk about why we gave the scores that we gave as verified by actual documentation in the proposals. Thirdly, here is crosswalk the findings to the proposal. Now, what do I mean by that? That crosswalk is to take, here's our RFP requirements, here's your proposal, and line these up together. Talk about here's where your proposal missed based on the actual requirements in our RFP as a great way to defend yourself in a protest situation. Now, folks, we may not think about this last point here, but if somebody files a protest that actually has merit, that is legitimate, our recommendation is deal with it sooner than later. It's kind of like ripping off the Band-Aid. Rip that thing off, deal with it soon, acknowledge that there was an issue, and respond to that as fast as we can. That would be, our thinking here, right? Now, someone might be thinking, well, okay, if they use the evidences in my Q&A or the evidence as my solicitation as a way to file a protest, why not stay vague so that no one can actually pin a deviation on me as a procurement officer? So here's some thoughts about that. The first thing, it can actually backfire. If we're too vague, there's no standard, I would actually argue that's more likely you're going to get protested, and more likely you're going to be sustained, or in other words, lose that protest in the first place. So it can actually backfire. It shrinks your discretion for what you can do as part of a procurement agent. And actually, what we have found time and again is that publishing your evaluation criteria makes it more protest proof, because people understand, or in other words, our transparency has gone up, and the vendors really appreciate that. The accountability never leaves here. I mean, most of us work for public entities, and because of that, what took place and what transpired most of the time is public record, and they have access to that information through FOIA requests or other types of Freedom of Information Act, that they can actually see perhaps what took place on the project. So the honest fix here is that, our fear about being protested is legitimate, but the fix here is not to be quiet about what our concerns are. The fix here is that, yeah, we're nervous about that, but if we do what we say we're going to do and then follow through on that, problem solved. Or I should say, problem less painful, or problem perhaps avoided in the first place. Right? That's what we want to do here. So win a protest does not win the contract. Again, if the GAO goes through and makes a recommendation, they're not going to recommend who should get the award. Most oftentimes, they're going to recommend redo the proposal evaluations, amend the solicitation, give more time, or just cancel an award altogether. So the real cost here, I should put this in bigger font. The real cost is really down here, is that if you are an agency that is constantly being protested, and not just frivolous, I know there's certain types of contracts that constantly get protested. That's not what this is here. But if the idea that gets out into the industry that we as an agency are difficult to work for, and we don't always follow our rules, it's really hard to get through that and overcome those concerns here. So a fair evaluation is not protest defense overhead. It makes vendors willing to compete on our future RFPs. So providing those RFPs in a way, those debriefings in a way that actually makes sense, your vendors will really appreciate that. And it will make a difference going forward as we think about that. So 3 major takeaways. Half of all protests succeed, meaning they get something out of it, not that necessarily that 14%. The same root cause is the same every single year, which is not doing what we said we're going to do. Number 3 here is that if you tell us you're going to do something, then make sure you actually do that. All right, folks, so a couple quick reminders. Again, we've got a huge audience today, which is just fantastic. It's so great to see many of you. If it's your first time here, welcome. Thank you for being here. If you have friends or your departments or colleagues that might have an interest, we have this every single month, 12 p.m. Central, online. So definitely feel free to invite your friends, go to the website. We are also going to post a recording from today's session. Give us a couple days, that'll be on the CP website. We also have classes, we also through NASPO, through Procurement U. Brian, I don't think you have the links handy for the upcoming course. I don't have them in front of me, but we do have some upcoming classes. We have better RFPs, better projects class. And in terms of the next dates we have available in August, we'll have our next better RFPs class. We'll also have in September the 1, 2, 3s of grade scoring matrix. And then also in October, we'll have our deep dive on effective evaluation. So if you want to attend those classes, those are free, offered through NASPO. Be sure to sign up, and that would be fantastic, and to go through and take a look at that. We have other topics as well for our RFP doctor next month is people leave. We know that turnover is guaranteed. So we'll talk about how to deal with the new workforce shifts. Folks, just a little preview on that. We are seeing, I think seismic is a good word to use. Seismic demographic changes are happening right now. And we don't always see these things in our professional careers. And so those changes are coming. We're going to talk about what those look like. And then finally here, we have new topics that are coming out. Brian and I spent, I don't know how much time we spent on this last couple of weeks, but we've got a bunch of new topics. We have everything planned out from now until December of 2027. So we got the next year and a half planned out. We're going to do a series on trust and procurement.
It'll never change, right, Jake?
What's that, Brian?
And it'll never change. It's locked in.
Yes, nothing changes, and if it does change, then we quit. So, anyways, after the award, what to do, bonds and insurance. I think that was an idea from last month. Somebody suggested us we're going to do a little research study. We'll talk about what we find with that. We'll talk about AI leading to procurement, the true cost of low bid. The answer is get rid of low bid, but I digress, and some other topics as well. So that's kind of what's on the bar here. So, folks, again, thank you so much for being here today. And Brian, I have not been checking the chat box, but we have a record number of questions and comments and anything else here. So, Brian, any commentary, anything else you want to offer here?
First one is for the people emailing or sending, not emailing me, chatting me individually for the code again. There it is, World Cup 26, no capitalizations. But no, a lot of good conversations. The one that stuck out to me in the chat was some of the and many people were interacting with this, was when you perform a solid debriefing, it is common to have the supplier or vendor community actually thank you and be so surprised at how informative it was, how much information you gave, how valuable that is to them. So if you're looking for a barometer on whether you are in best practice range with debriefings, if you haven't been thanked personally by the supplier saying thank you for doing that, that was so helpful, that means you can probably go further. Happy to chat about that. I've had it be suppliers be so thankful that they will say that all the time and money they spent on the proposal response, even though they didn't win, they would spend it again in a heartbeat just to get that type of feedback from a client group, like whichever one you're working for. It's very valuable for them. A lot of debriefings, even when they are offered, are just terrible. They don't provide much information. And so it's a waste of everyone's time a lot of times. So there's that. There's other comments around vendors asking about the experience level of the evaluators, and asking who they were and that type of thing. There's a balance there. I think that it's true that what's the first rule in marketing, right? And that's what these are, right? We're proposing back to win a project is marketing, good, bad, or ugly. A lot of comments we can give on that, but the first rule of marketing is know your audience. And so it is valuable for the suppliers to have some insight into who are they submitting the proposal to. We talk about that a lot in our RFP training courses around how to set up a solid evaluation team. And we always tell suppliers, especially in our pre-proposal meetings, that, hey, you need to write this from a non-technical standpoint. Yeah, you're going to have some technical subject matter experts with familiarity of the scope and details on the evaluation team, but you're also going to have other end users and other department participation that may not be a pure technical subject matter expert in this specific project. And you need to be mindful of that as well. So usually, not every time, but usually if a supplier is asking like, well, your your evaluators probably weren't experienced enough to truly get what I was saying in the proposal. If that's kind of what they're insinuating, ultimately what they're admitting is they didn't do a good job with their proposal. And that's on them. That's not on you. It's not your job as an evaluation team to go in and figure out what the supplier meant or how good it was supposed to be. That's not your job. As some like to say that, more objective criteria, and it's the vendor's job to differentiate themselves from their competition. That's not your job on the evaluation team, would be some of the comments there.
Fantastic. Lynn, I really like your comment about he enjoys providing those debriefings and provide excellent value. That is my hat's off to you, Lynn, and Jordan, the other folks that really spend time on that, because it makes a difference, folks. As we've kind of seen, you want to avoid a protest, talk to your vendors.
Right, with the debriefs, I know that my debriefs aren't necessarily going to, right, because the RFP isn't going to roll around again in my agency for 1 or 2 or 5 years, or maybe never again, because it's a CMGC for some gigantic thing, and that CMGC is never going to roll around again. But if I can get out to those vendors, right, because my suppliers are City of Portland suppliers, are Washington County suppliers, or City of Tigard suppliers, right? They're all there. If I can get to them and say, okay, here was what it was, and here are the places where my evaluators didn't know what to do with you because you didn't answer the question, right? You didn't answer the question in a way, and how that relates back to Multnomah County. So when you're proposing with somebody else, read the question, answer the question in full, and then tie it up with a pretty little bow by saying, and this is how it benefits you. This Multnomah County is how our experience benefits you. This Washington County is how what we do here, how we've answered the question, how it translates and directly benefits you as for us to be your supplier. And I have had more than one, I would say probably 3 suppliers be successful with different entities after having had that debrief. So, right, my work here is done, right? I may not be able to get you a contract with Multnomah County as much as I like you and would love to work with you. First off, I'm not an evaluator, and second off, that would be right. That breaks rules.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I'm a rule follower. I will push the boundary, but I will not break that boundary.
Yeah.
And like I said, and at least 3 that I can think of immediately have come back and has said, because of that debrief, because of that conversation that we had, that was a hard conversation to have, was able to provide a better response to somebody else and got the contract from that. So that's why
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, that's why I love it, right? It's not about whether or not they're going to do business with Multnomah County. It's about whether or not our businesses are being successful in it, and
Yep.
and our economies are strong.
And I like what
So,
you said about it being a conversation. That's a key thing that I've found as well is I try to have it be an actual conversation. I'm not just sending here's your debriefing document with some stuff written up. I usually have the conversation. We do pull up the document with the information that we're putting together for them, and then send it to them after so that you can do exactly what you said, Lynn, and have that conversation.
yep. It's just what happened if the protesting party is not satisfied with the determination of the entity? I just saw somebody's question pull up. I'll let you talk about that, or if you want me to, I can too, because we have, right? It's hierarchical.
That's right.
It goes up. It would go to our attorneys. It would go to our board. It would potentially end up as they could sue you. They could.
Yeah, and many of those, like we talked with the GAO, that's what happens. I mean, they
Yep.
can eventually get to lawsuits, but I mean that's a whole lot more time that we don't want to deal with here. But there's a hierarchy.
There is.
And one kind of thought I had too, if you think about the number one reason why protests are sustained or even filed is that owners didn't do what they said they're going to do here. And I'm not necessarily offering a professional opinion on this here, but and I'm not going down a rabbit hole, but as AI continues to develop, part of what that can do for you is you can have it check against here's what our solicitation was, here's what our source selection plan is, or in other words, our game plan. And you can ask it, does this match what we said we're going to do in the solicitation? And it can provide insights and comments. And I would just thinking out loud about this here, that would be certainly a beneficial thing to do is perhaps use some of the technologies available here to double check like, hey, we're about to do this. Is there anything that I have said previously, either in Q&A or my RFP, that would go against what I'm planning on doing here, provide some insights. Again, certainly it may not always be perfect, but that would certainly be, I think, an outstanding use case to verify, am I about to get myself in trouble here? And if so, show me what we should perhaps do better on the next time. Very good. What else?
I just want to follow on with what you said there about the how we can get better. That's another thing I actually ask in my debriefs, particularly on questions where multiple suppliers struggled to answer the question right. I mean, there are a couple of questions that we have that I know just suck, and I rewrite them all the time. But asking right those suppliers the question that okay, so here's what it was, and here's how you didn't meet it. How could I have structured this better so that you would have been able to answer the question? And because we're never perfect, right? And in Portland, we have, in lots of places too, we have lots of native suppliers. We have lots of BIPOC suppliers. And the way that they have been trained and brought up in their businesses doesn't necessarily look the same way as if you've been trained and brought up in Fortis's business model, right? Small, a small native company out in the middle of Oregon doesn't necessarily have that same kind of view to things. And so the questions that I'm asking might not make sense to them in the way that I mean, it may be a very clear question, but it still might not be meaningful to them. Like if you ask me, what are you proud of? I'm like, I don't understand what you mean, because that's just not an operating system I have. Um, and maybe I'm asking a question in an operating system that they don't have in their brain access to. So that's another thing I do with my debriefs.
Yeah, and some of the folks in the chat had mentioned earlier that you can ask for feedback on your procurement process, evaluation criteria, timeline, and also scope. Is there anything that was murky or that we could have done better there? All those little tips are helpful. So I'd like to make sure it's a two-way street in those debriefings for sure. We also had, sometimes you are told by the powers that be that you have to do things in certain ways on solicitations. And when those go against best practices, that's something you can discuss in debriefs and get some ammunition for, hey, to what extent, when we did X, Y, or Z in our solicitation, how does that compare with national standards, regional standards, other client groups? And you have a nice little survey group there that you can come back to leadership and say, hey, everyone said what we did here is out of line with what would be typical. And sometimes that's okay. But if it's something that you really think is the wrong way to go, sometimes the suppliers can give you that ammunition.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.